Oh dear, it's like being at school where the front rows are empty and the middle rows and the back rows are full. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respect to their elders past and present. My name's Tim Wilson. I'm Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, but on top of that, I'm also the de facto Commissioner for issues related to sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status issues. This evening's Rights Talk is a partnership between the Australian Human Rights Commission, the AIDS Council of New South Wales and the Pacific Friends of the Global Fund. And I'd like to particularly acknowledge ACON CEO Nick Parkhill. Where are you, Nick? Everybody give Nick a round of applause. And the Pacific Friends Executive Director, Bill Botel. Where are you, Bill? There you are, right up the front. Few issues provide the opportunity to explore the synergy between human rights and health than HIV. This is particularly true in relation to the Australian epidemic, in which gay men and other men who have sex with men, sex workers and intravenous drug users have been at the centre of a largely effective public health response. The nature of HIV means that the spread of the epidemic is vastly accelerated by discrimination. Of course, I am a strong advocate for the role of civil society in the realisation of human rights. My approach to human rights holds that the centrality and the importance of the empowered individual is at its foundation. This approach has been a hallmark of the Australian response to HIV for many years. For years, civil society, particularly people living with HIV, have led efforts against injustice. To this end, I recall the profoundly powerful words of the Denver Principles, written in 1982, amidst what is, by contemporary Australian standards, tragic, unimaginable deaths, fear and uncertainty. That, quote, "We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS. We reserve the right to die and to live in dignity." The Australian response has honoured this right to self-determination by placing affected populations at the centre of any strategy of government. Community has sat at the table with clinicians and epidemiologists, as well as legislators and policymakers. This approach has ensured that human rights of the individual are respected, protected and fulfilled, while simultaneously developing an evidence-based practice model for effectively addressing HIV. Today's event, of course, is an example of a partnership between civil society and government. In the words of the UN AIDS Reference Group on Human Rights defined the AIDS response. They should also define the end of AIDS and the global health response beyond, which is why it's such a great pleasure to have here this evening Mark Dybel from the Global Fund, who deals directly with the challenges not just faced here, but particularly overseas for those who have HIV, in making sure that there is proper policy responses to improve the standards of living of people and to address directly issues of infections. Mark has worked on HIV and public health for more than 20 years as a clinician, scientist, teacher and administrator. After graduating from Georgetown Medical School in Washington, D.C., Dybel joined the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where he conducted basic and clinical studies on HIV virology, get that word right, immunology and treatment of optimization, including the first randomized controlled trial with combination antiretroviral therapy in Africa. Dybel became a founding architect and driving force in the formation of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, better known as PEPFAR. After serving as Chief Medical Officer, Assistant Deputy and Acting Director, he was appointed as its leader in 2006, becoming US Global AIDS Coordinator with the rank of Ambassador at the level of an Assistant Secretary of State. Does that mean I have to refer to you as Ambassador this evening?
Not until I
Okay, not until I leave this job. He served until early 2009. Before coming to the Global Fund, Dybel was coordinator or co-director of the Global Health Law Program at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health law at Georgetown University, where he was also a distinguished scholar. Deibel has written extensively in scientific and policy literature and has received several honorary degrees and awards. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Mark Deibel.
Thank you, Tim, Commissioner Wilson. And thanks very much to the Commission for hosting us here tonight, and to Nick and the Council, National AIDS Council, for co-joining, and of course Bill Botel and the Pacific Friends. This is a great venue to be talking about this issue, I think, in Sydney. And Bill, in particular, I've known a long time, people like Mike Kirby, Nick, others in this room, who led the fight to bring human rights and the human rights perspective to the epidemic here, and Australia's response, which really was focused on the marginalized and key affected population. Don Baxter's here as well. So we're delighted to be here tonight to talk about this incredibly important issue. In the end, human rights, well, in the beginning, actually, human rights start with a fundamental belief in the dignity and worth of every human being. And as a result of that dignity and worth, and from that foundational thought, specific rights are conferred. The right to health is among those. The right to health has been recognized for decades now, going back at least to 1950 or before. And it's an important avenue from which to look at human rights and the dignity and worth of every human right and every human being. We need everyone involved in that perspective, everyone involved in the right to health, and then everyone involved in the human right nature of health. But to some extent, health and perhaps HIV and tuberculosis uniquely offer a very specific and, again, unique lens through which to view human rights. HIV and TB are really remarkable among infectious diseases. Most diseases are indiscriminate. Most infectious communicable diseases, that's why we call them that, are indiscriminate. Whether it's Ebola, influenza, or most infectious diseases we're familiar with, whether you're rich or poor, young or old, you are at equal risk of acquiring these infections if you come into contact with them. HIV and TB are somewhat unique. They are very discriminatory infections that actually prey on discrimination, thrive on discrimination. And it is the most marginalized and vulnerable in communities that are at greatest risk to HIV and tuberculosis infections. This includes the LGBTI community, particularly men who have sex with men, transgender people, people who inject drugs, prisoners, migratory populations, sex workers, and a population we don't often talk about is a marginalized population, adolescent girls and young women, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, who are at remarkable risk of HIV infection. Beginning with them, the overall infection rate among adolescent girls and young women for HIV is 2 times higher than among young men. That's pretty remarkable, but when you go into certain communities, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, it can be 5 to 1 to 10 to 1. And the reason for that is gender-based violence, rape, abuse of women and girls, and transgenerational sex, often driven by transactional sex, where women are actually encouraged to, forced to, or just to get by their families to bring some money home. And so engage in other activity that puts them at very high risk of HIV infection. Among people who inject drugs, prisoners, men who have sex with men, and the LGBTI community more generally, particularly transgender, people who inject drugs, rates can be just breathtakingly, almost unbelievably high. 50 to 70% of populations HIV positive, of those populations HIV positive. In some places around the world, for example, in parts of Eastern Europe, a person who injects drugs is 50 times more likely to be HIV positive than someone in the general population. These numbers give us a sense of the incredible discriminatory nature of HIV. Tuberculosis is very similar in some respect because in sub-Saharan Africa, at least, HIV and TB are one disease. HIV promotes TB infection by immunocompromised status, and TB actually also destroys the damages the immune system. And so there's a vicious cycle between tuberculosis and HIV. The exciting thing at this moment, despite those rather frightening numbers and the frightening rate of disease in those who are marginalized and left behind, are two historic opportunities. The first historic opportunity is to actually end the epidemics of HIV, TB, and malaria, and I use that term specifically, end the epidemic, because at least in the case of HIV, we don't have the ability to eliminate. But in the case of tuberculosis and malaria, we can eliminate those diseases. And we've advanced in science, in our epidemiological understanding of the infections, and very importantly, because of the massive investments of the last 10 to 15 years, an understanding of how to use that science and that epidemiology to control the infections. And so because of those advances, this is the first generation of policymakers, the first generation in history that can end the epidemics of HIV, TB, and malaria. I mean, just think about that for a moment. HIV, TB, and malaria have been around literally since recorded medical history. Since we have any medical records, TB and malaria have been around, but we now have the tools to eliminate those diseases. This region in particular has made very impressive progress on malaria. TB, in some countries, but very challenging, particularly around Australia, with a case today, actually. Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and other countries in this region have really frightening tuberculosis rates, often among key affected populations. And HIV is the modern plague, the modern Black Death. So to think that if we utilize resources and focus, that we could bring these three plagues under control or eliminate them is rather extraordinary. That's truly historic. You don't get many chances in life to end diseases that have been around for thousands of years. But there's a second historic opportunity linked to the numbers we've talked about. And that is to defeat these diseases, to eliminate or bring them under control, we actually have to change how we behave towards each other, how we function as human beings, to create an inclusive human family that not only deals with, but welcomes into the community of human beings, a community of our human family, people who have historically been marginalized, vulnerable, and left behind by society. And that's pretty extraordinary, to fight disease and to fight discrimination and to make us better people at the same time. And that's why we're delighted to be here at the Human Rights Commission in this country to talk about this issue. Rights confer duties too. And so we have a responsibility. If you have that opportunity and you have the right to health, we have a responsibility and a duty to respond to that. And so that is something we all work on to respond to that opportunity and to that duty. Specifically related to human rights, and I want to come back to the specific lens that you can use with health to approach human rights. Human rights is a pillar of the Global Fund strategy. It's one of the 5 pillars of our strategy. And it's there for the reasons we talked about, because of the vulnerable populations, because we cannot tackle these epidemics. And we need all lenses, as I pointed out. We need a Human Rights Commission. We need to make the arguments that it is a rights-based approach, that it is a human right to health, that it is a human right to have access to services for HIV, TB, and malaria. But you can have a slightly different conversation, and we can take different approaches to achieve an outcome. And when you have a discussion with a head of state, or a minister of finance, or a minister of health in a country that has laws, discriminatory laws against certain populations, that's based in rights, purely in rights, it can be a very challenging conversation, usually a very short conversation, as we often see in the Human Rights Council, or a very acrimonious conversation. When you approach it from health, when you approach it with data, when you show that it is not possible to control epidemics in a country unless you address these issues, unless you address populations, you have a very different conversation. Michel Sidibé at UNAIDS is uniquely and remarkably effective at this as an African man, a Francophone African man, when he steps up and talks about these issues from the view of a health response, and he gets a really remarkable reaction. I've had the privilege, and we travel around specifically together to meet with heads of state and ministers about these issues. He's remarkably effective because he can address things in a way, and he can say, and he has the money to make that happen. So it's a very unique approach and a very effective approach that is a different conversation. And I will just give you one example. In Kenya, the parliament was considering a law not too dissimilar from other countries. The cabinet secretary for health, who also happens to be a former banker, he didn't have much of a health background, learned about the epidemic in Kenya. He learned that there are only 3 hotspots left, that Kenya actually has a pretty good response. And in 2 of those hotspots, Nairobi and Mombasa, the major group at risk and the major reason they still have infection is because of HIV, or because of populations that are most vulnerable and left behind, including men who have sex with men. And that if Kenya wanted to respond to the epidemic, this law would be counterproductive. It would actually make that virtually impossible. He was also able to say that, by the way, I'm a former banker, and it's not such a smart move if we want international investment to do this type of law either. The parliament defeated the law. And these are the kinds of conversations you can have in a very different way than if it's only a rights-based approach that's data-driven, that relates to the health of people. Faith leaders are quite responsive to this approach as well. There are very few faith leaders that don't care about the health of the members of their community, who don't care whether their community members live or die. A bishop in South Africa once famously said, I believe in A, B, C, and D, for those of you who know that: abstinence, be faithful, use a condom, or you'll die. That was because of the data, and that was because of what he saw in his community. And so when you take use a health lens, which is what our strategy requires, to address a human rights problem, you approach in a different angle, can reach different populations and groups and leaders, and have a different approach, but a related approach, so that we get to that end, which is a human rights-based approach to health that recognizes the dignity and worth of every human life, that recognizes from that foundational thought, from that foundational principle, that specific rights are conferred, including the right to health, and including the right for every person to thrive in society and create that human family, that inclusive human family, which will be the betterment of all of us individually and collectively, and create a more perfect world. So thank you very much for inviting us here, Commissioner, and I look forward to the conversation and dialogue.
What about this again? Just gonna put this microphone on. Keep it on. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that presentation. Now, I'm not sure about the collective knowledge of the people in the room, but also those who are watching via web stream at home. Do you just want to give us a broad overview, a quick broad overview of what the Global Fund does and how it contributes to addressing the issues you've just raised with relation to HIV and TB and malaria?
So the Global Fund is a rather unique institution. We're a multilateral organization, but a very different multilateral organization, our type of multilateral organization. We were actually created as a public-private partnership and reflecting some principles that were revolutionary to some degree in development around the turn of this past century, that we needed to take an approach that was not paternalistic, but partnership-based, versus our past development efforts, that we needed to focus on country ownership and country leadership. And to do that, we had to have a results-based, good governance, and engage all sectors. And those sound like common sense, but they weren't so well received in some quarters 15 years ago when they were being adopted. And the Global Fund was actually created specifically out of those principles. And so if you look at our structure, you can see that reflected. In our board of directors, all of those pieces are represented. So we have, of 20 seats, a seat for the private sector. We have a seat for private foundations. We have 3 seats for civil society. Voting members of our board, Don Baxter, who's here, was one of them. So it's a very unique structure, and but we weren't created to be a structure. We weren't created to just respond to principles. We were actually created to support countries with those principles to achieve a world that's free of HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria.
And how do those different agents and different players, apart from sitting on the board, contribute to the work of the Global Fund? And of course, that also would include our government about how it contributes to the operations and financing of the Global Fund.
It's a very good question. Again, it breaks with the past, and I wouldn't say breaks with, was a natural evolution from the past of bilateral programs. I used to run a massive bilateral program, as you mentioned. The difference is that we go through country mechanisms. We have no country presence. It's a partnership. And we're a financing mechanism. We're not a technical agency. So we provide finance to a in-country developed strategy, under the national strategy, where all partners come together through a dialogue process to achieve the best outcome. So, for example, in the case of Australia, you contribute in quite a number of ways. One is through direct finance. Australia is the 13th largest contributor to the fund, with a commitment that Minister Bishop made last year of $200 million over a 3-year period. We have an annual spend of about $4 billion, or a little more than $12.5 billion now over this next finance period. And those resources then are put into countries with a certain allocation to fight those diseases and build health systems, resilient health systems. So Australia provides finance. You're on our board. You're actually an alternate member of our board, along with the United Kingdom and your constituency. And then in country, because we're not a technical partner, we work with technical partners in country to support the development of a national plan that will have greatest impact. And so, especially in this region, where your Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade have a strong presence and strong technical expertise, when those plans are developed, Australia is very much present. You also are present through your non-governmental organizations. So, for example, Don goes around the country, goes around the world supporting programs around MSM and LGBTI and ensuring that those are integrated in countries that have high rates, which is many of the countries we work in, and that civil society is fully engaged. Oil search, private sector, of course, from Australia is one of our implementers in Papua New Guinea, for example. So it's a very complex web. The general approach is who in every country needs to be at the table through whatever mechanism, technical support, implementation, external resource to support civil society growth to achieve the greatest impact. And because of the uniqueness of HIV and TB in particular that we talked about, if you don't have all those pieces, you actually won't get to a response.
Happy to take questions from the floor, by the way, if people have questions. But just to pick up on something you said in your speech, which was particularly around how discrimination can exacerbate a public health challenge, like the spread of these types of viruses or diseases. Up in Queensland, the state to the north of us, there's a different law for anal penetrative sex versus vaginal sex, which the age of consent is different between 16 and 18, which of course has an impact directly on the number of people who can lawfully go and get tested for HIV, particularly amongst young gay men, and as a consequence can lead to a situation where there is a greater spread of HIV, and that if they brought that law up to into compliance to 16 with both essentially heterosexual and homosexual sex, you would see potentially greater rates of testing and a reduction in infections. What are the other types of experiences from around the world about where lawful discrimination amounts to direct spreading of these types of diseases?
Well, that sounds bad in the Australian context, but it actually be pretty mild in most other settings. So
there was just to highlight, it does even occur here. But
there are actually 67, according to UNAIDS, 67 countries in the world that have pretty severely discriminatory laws based on stigmatized populations, particularly around MSM and the LGBTI community. 67. You know, there's been a lot of media focus on a couple recently, but it's actually 67. And there's a range of them, but some can include very severe penalties, imprisonment. Some of them actually in parts actually started tracing someone who knew that someone was gay and didn't report it was as culpable as the person who's gay. So there can be very difficult laws, and of course these with sex workers we see very similar laws that criminalize sex work, and there's work on decriminalization that is happening around the world, but there's still criminalization. Now, you have to take a different, legally, we are focused on 5 particular issues, or 5 areas of law, and trying to work so that laws don't result in HIV in particular growing. But we don't do it on our own as a non-technical agency. So the UNDP, our UN Development Program, actually has a great project that Michael Kirby from Australia is very active in to try to work with countries in a legal framework that would limit stigma and discrimination that leads to increases in HIV and other communicable diseases. So it's a very good framework, and we use that framework within, as a non-technical agency, you know, to bring that framework within the country dialogue so that people are looking at and considering it. A good example would be in the Caribbean region, actually, where there is something called PANCAP, the AIDS, I can't remember what it stands for. Too many acronyms in the world. Caribbean and something, Latin American Caribbean. And it was a struggle for a long time, but they actually held a meeting last year in Jamaica with ministers of justice, heads of state, prime ministers were there, in countries that have very serious laws, to talk about relief. How could we make progress over time? What would the steps be? Now, automatic repeal could be very difficult, but what steps can be taken? And then there's the opportunity in countries even that have laws to that limit the ability to engage in programs to work so that programs can still go on. And that is a huge opportunity for us, because over time, as people come into contact, work with, welcome people into a community, over time that can lead to changes in thoughts, perceptions. You know, when you actually meet someone, as opposed to hearing about, you know, their sexual orientation, when you're sitting in a room with them, when you're talking about a community, when you're talking about their community and the community that they live in, it's a very different thing. And once those dialogues start happening, we can see things change pretty quickly. So, of course, we'd like to see the discriminatory laws removed, but it's a process, and we need to work through that process to get to the outcome that we need.
Question here.
Cheers.
Hi, Janelle.
Janelle Fawkes from Scarlet Alliance, the Australian Sex Workers Association. I think it's a great conversation for us to be having in New South Wales, particularly because it's one of the few places in the world where sex work is decriminalised. So good that we're starting the discussion here. But as you describe that need to have the evidence and to frame our discussions about human rights within the health space, the Lancet research delivered at AIDS 2014 that identifies very clearly that the potential to reduce HIV transmission or rates by between 33 to 46% purely by decriminalising sex work, that really puts a different swing on the prioritisation of where changes to legislation fit within HIV response, we think, as sex workers. So whilst we've got the evidence and we're having the discussions, we're really, that momentum where governments come along with us, but also large organisations and entities start to talk openly about decriminalisation as what we need, not just some vague enabling environment or other phrase. I think we need to get to that point. So it's good to hear you state very clearly decriminalisation is what's needed. Sex work has been saying that for a very long time. But in our region, statements have been made recently by both PNG and Fiji, referring to their support, some ministers, for decriminalisation of sex work. But really we need a very strong push to get that across the line, because the reality is in most countries, throughout the world, there's some form of criminalisation of sex work. Any thoughts?
I don't think I have anything much add to what I already said. It's going to be a process in countries. I was just in South Africa, where this is a very live conversation and a consultation with sex workers about some of their new legislation. They're looking at a range of things, which the Deputy Minister of Justice was very clear about. But also the challenges they have, the political challenges to move these things. And the reality is that outsiders coming in from international organizations saying you need to do this doesn't work particularly well, and we've learned that pretty to our detriment. Having conversations in different ways about the data and the information is quite different, and so that's what we're focused on, because that's what we do as an organization, and that's what our strategy says, that we view rights through that health lens, through that HIV lens. There are great organizations, and we work closely with UNDP that works on these issues. UNAIDS, works on these issues. This is a principal action for them. We're a financing tool, but we can bring the dialogue together, and that's what we serve as, an opportunity for countries to bring the voices together around a dialogue to begin to move these things. I don't want to say with whom because it's on camera, but I was talking with a very well-known African about some of these issues across the range of MSM and sex work, and people inject drugs, which is becoming much more of an issue in Africa, actually, much more than we probably know, and certainly in this region. And I asked him how we could make progress on this, and I was very surprised. I was like, well, we need the NGOs, we need everyone involved. And he made a really good point. It was like, we push and we push and we push, and then all of a sudden things change, and we have no idea why. We have no idea what it was. And it's probably everything all at once coming in, and we don't know what that change was. And often after the change happens, we look back and say, well, of course we did that. It makes perfect sense. But the process to get there, and it's going to be different in every country, and the actors that need to be there are going to be different in every country, and how those forces come together will be different in every country. So I do think there's a danger in a one-size-fits-all, one answer for all, because it's probably not going to work, or the expectation that international organizations or the Human Rights Council weighing in on something is going to flip the switch. It won't. It is an important part, but there are other important parts, and that's the key, that we look at all those parts and look at each country and even region of country in a unique way and try to understand the factors that are most likely to make progress in that place in the best possible way. And so I think and that's really the type of partnership that the Global Fund can represent, where all the actors come together in the best possible way to try to advance things as quickly as they can advance.
There's a question up the back there.
Yeah, my name is John Kelly. I'm from Atomo Diagnostics. We're Australia's only developer and manufacturer of rapid diagnostics for HIV and malaria. And the vast majority of our product goes to Africa. Our experience is there's a lot of vulnerable groups that don't test, primarily because they don't want to test in government-regulated clinics. I'd be keen to get your thoughts on how the Global Fund and the future of public health programs for self-testing for HIV.
We don't actually have a position on that as a non-technical agency. I think the basic answer is whatever's going to work is what should be used, and that the technical agencies need to weigh in on that. And it's gone back and forth on self-testing in a variety of places, and different countries view it differently. You don't actually necessarily have to have self-testing. There are actually some fantastic programs, including in countries that have laws against marginalized populations, that are community-based organizations where the community goes out and brings the people in and makes them feel welcome. You don't have to have a self-test to solve these problems. That might be a solution in some places. Again, I think it's important to look at what's the best solution in a country. And the most important thing is to engage the communities. And it's not just testing. You got to go in for services. You need community support for that. There's a whole lot of things that need to be done. It's not just testing. And so if those pieces aren't in place, and if you don't even have access to them, if you can get a self-test, but you don't have access to commodities or to clinics or to healthcare workers, that's not going to be helpful either. So it's really putting all the pieces together and allowing, and this is something we have not done well, it's the shift in development. Focus on the country, focus on the community in the country, focus on the community in the province and the state, in the locale, because that's where the solutions are going to be. And I think being here in Sydney is a great example of that. The problems got solved when the community got involved, when they raised the rights issues, when the government responded. And we met with the Minister of Health here, who's just awesome and is really pushing. MSM rates are increasing in many high-income countries around the world, including here in Australia. So it's great to see a premier or Minister of Health in a high-income country really recognizing that things have changed and addressing it. But you have to work with the community. What's going to work in this community? And I don't think there's a technological solution. There isn't a community solution. There's no one solution to any of this. It's what's going to work in this environment with this community today, and then work on that. And that's the beauty of the new approach to development, to take it away from high-level conversation into community to say, how are we going to solve this problem?
Sorry, just for a second, for those who are watching on web stream at home, there was just a comment that there was a disconnect between what local communities may want and what laws may operate depending on the country.
We can't purchase a product for a country in a country where it's illegal. So there's nothing we can do about that. It's the allocations go to the countries and spend in the countries. No one can bring a product into a country where it's not legal. So then you need to work with the community to get the law changed. I mean, that's the only way to do it, right? So we're not a technical agency. That's the realm of the World Health Organization and UNAIDS to work on, to provide that global guidance, which then can make a difference in how people view laws. But if a country if a product is illegal in a country, no one can bring that into the country.
Just building off that question then, we've spoken a lot about the role of government and different international organisations. Clearly a significant contributor to addressing these challenges directly is the role of the private sector. Can you perhaps give us some guidance about where the private sector is making a really positive contribution, particularly in countries part of that model?
Yeah, and this is also a complicated question because there's no one size fits all here, and there are different ways the private sector contributes currently and can contribute in very significant ways. One is money.
Everybody loves money.
Yeah. So Product Red, which Bono created, is an organization where companies can make a product red, turn a product red, and then a % of that proceed goes to the Global Fund, actually. And they were particularly interested in HIV. So Apple, Starbucks, these huge corporations have components. They've raised $250 million actually over the last 10 years for the Global Fund. So it's money. BHP Billiton here is actually a direct contributor to the Global Fund. Chevron's a direct contributor to the Global Fund. So we have different corporations that provide money, and they do it because they see the impact on their own business, right? I mean, you need health for development. Particularly around malaria, the mining companies, the extractives saw that they were losing 1/3 of their workforce during malaria season. It's pretty hard to operate when that's happening. But they also believe in the mission, and so we've seen this really unique and important contribution of the private sector there. Second way is in our governance structure. We have a seat for the private sector, which is somewhat unique. But perhaps the most important piece is innovation and the innovation they can create. Now, they're not the only source of innovation. Some of the best innovation happening right now is actually at the community level on how you operationalize and deliver things. But the private sector has some very remarkable innovations in areas, and the areas that we've identified where we're partnering in public-private partnerships are financial and risk management as one, procurement and supply chain as another, and quality assurance of programs, which is really how you collect and use data, not just for reporting, but to improve programs so you get the greatest outcome. I'll just focus on one for now, and that's supply chain, Coca-Cola. We could ask Coke for money, that would be nice. Or we could say, you have one of the best distribution systems in the world. You can get a bottle of Coca-Cola to any village in any place in the world. Could you work with us not to add antiretrovirals onto your trucks and go deliver them? That's not going to be very useful. But can you work and embed people in the Ministry of Health to work on a supply chain that's functional? That's precisely what they did in Tanzania. And they're actually building a national supply chain, helping to build a national supply chain in Tanzania. They've done so well and it's worked so well, and the Tanzanians are so thrilled with it that It's moving to 7 to 9 countries. So that's the type of innovation that can really drive change. And then implementation. There are places where the private sector actually can implement because of limitations in government or non-government, other civil society non-governmental structures. One of the examples is across the border in Papua New Guinea, where Oil Search is an implementer for HIV programs with the Global Fund and a sub-implementer for malaria. In Ghana, Ashanti Gold is one of our implementers for malaria. And you know, it's not a long-term sustainable thing to have private sector implementers in an organization like the Global Fund, but over time they can, we have to work with whomever has the best opportunity to reach people for now and build capacity over time. So in each of those layers, the private sector is deeply embedded. It's important to note that the private sector is not a panacea either. It's not going to solve all of our problems. And it gets back to the fact of what our board looks like. You need everyone to bring their expertise to the table. Everyone has a role here. Every sector has a role. Every organization has a role. And the key is to bring them all together in a way that gets the biggest impact and draw from the private sector what the private sector can offer extremely effectively.
There's a question up the back there, yes. More mid-level, but...
Hi, my name's Holly, and I've just come back from working with UNAIDS in Cambodia. And one of the key issues that we face, that we're working on there with UNDP as well, is around access to medicines, specifically access to affordable generic medicines in the longer term. So at the moment, for least developed countries, access to generic medicines is protected to 2021, but at 2021, least developed countries will start having to implement patents. And that's going to affect their ability to import or export or produce themselves affordable generic medicines for HIV, but also TB, malaria, cancer, a lot of diseases. And I guess the issue is that these countries are starting, especially least developing countries, are starting to implement laws, and a lot of developed countries already have quite strong laws that protect patents, protect intellectual property rights. So for this reason, we have sort of public health flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights agreement. But what we found in Cambodia, I know it's happening in Myanmar and other places, is that these flexibilities aren't being implemented, or maybe a few of them are being implemented, but they're not being implemented to the extent to which they can be. When they are implemented, often they're challenged by pharmaceutical companies, and the result is that countries are not able to access cheap drugs. So, so I was just wondering sort of how that kind of relates to the right to health, and also to the, I guess, to the role of governments who implement these laws and the UN and other people who advise on these laws as duty bearers, how, I guess, their duty in terms of the right to health.
Sure. Thanks for that.
So the Global Fund policy is countries should procure the lowest cost quality product that they can, and that they should use whatever within the legal parameters, whether it's flexibilities or other thing they use. We are not a trade organization. We're not a, we don't know much about it. We don't have any technical people in that field, but that we encourage countries to access through whatever mechanisms they can, the lowest cost, high quality product. There are organizations, as you mentioned, like UNDP and others that work on these issues with countries to advance that. I would point out too that it's not just, there are different reasons for product cost. And some of it actually has to do with negotiating power. It has to do with forecasting. It has to do with a lot of different issues. And this is an issue we do have some place in because of our buying power. And so we have now created a really strong pooled procurement mechanism, because if you get high volume, you can actually drive price down substantially. So we brought in people from the private sector, which is another way we access private sector expertise, for our procurement and our financial management teams with 30, 35 years of experience. And we basically took the middle people out of the negotiation who were taking off their cut and weren't necessarily doing a good job. And then we also looked and said, how do we get to the largest volume we can get to? So the Global Fund alone, for example, in bed nets is about 50% of the external finance market. But if you add the US President's Emergency Plan, UNICEF, and DFID, you get to 85 to 90%, or 80 to 90, depending on the market. So then we jointly directly negotiated with countries and drove the price down. Doing the same in each of the commodities. We've saved about $500 million in the last 18 months. By we, I mean all of us. The countries, all of us have saved that. Countries are now preferentially buying into that system because of the cost that they can get for the commodities. But there's a problem with that, and that is as countries transition from low income to middle income to high income and actually transition out of institutions like the Global Fund, they won't have access to those procurement systems anymore because they're not part of the Global Fund. So we challenged our private sector teams to solve that problem. How do you solve that problem of country ownership and long-term sustainability through a pooled procurement mechanism? And they came up with a brilliant and simple solution, and brilliant solutions also are simple. So we're in the process of creating a kayak or priceline.com for health commodities. So that any country will be able to go in and say, I would like this number of products delivered on this date in this place, and all the competitive prices will pop up. And we'll also be able to put in filters for on-time delivery. So you'll be able to see who's delivering on time, and there'll be competition not only for price, but on-time delivery. It's something actually Australia does in its own health commodity procurement. And that's real market shaping. So we're in the first phase of that, and we're going to move to the second and third phase of that. And our goal is to spin it off as a global public health good. So that's not a Global Fund instrument. We'll have to start there, but actually a globally available mechanism with its own governance structure. And we're in the process of working on that and moving it forward. You have to be careful in that because we know you can drive prices so low that you drive competition out. And that actually happened in vaccines. And then you have one supplier, and it doesn't matter what the intellectual property is, you're going to have a tough time negotiating. So you have to do true market shaping. But you can do that, and with expertise, a lot of which comes from the private sector, these are the things financing institutions can work on to get high quality, low cost products available to people throughout the world, even who aren't functionally in our programs.
If we've got a final question, I'm happy to take it. But just to build on that, one of the things you kept saying was low cost, high quality. How much is the issue of quality a problem with relation to access to medications? Because a key part of intellectual property is to ensure that quality is secured as part of the process.
Yeah, that is true, but generic manufacturers actually also can have very high quality, and there's a WHO pre-qualification system in that. And so this is one of the advantages of a system like this, actually, is you would curate for quality standard. So it's pretty cool. Only quality products would be available through the website. So, you know, you're almost going to lose your market. You'd go out of business if you're providing, because if everyone's using that, there's no, but it is a problem, and we are dealing with this in a very large country, the big tuberculosis problem, where basically the Global Fund's been supporting quality product, and you know, through no fault of their own, they're trying to get the cheapest product, but it's not high quality product. In fact, there's very poor quality product, and we're all very worried about collapsing the quality market, and it's not the country's fault, they're just really squeezed. So by providing different mechanisms where countries can access quality products, we think we can try to solve this problem and get quality products to the lowest possible price. And generic manufacturers are quite capable of that.
I think we might take the final question here from Don up the front. The wonder of technology.
Just wanting to, just wondering if you could talk about human rights as one of the key objectives of the Global Fund in its overall strategy adopted in November 2011, and how in practice that's actually being rolled out. Or perhaps you could invite me to give my examples from Asia Pacific.
Here you go, Don. You can have this chair up on the stage if you want. Mark.
So as I mentioned, it's one of the 5 pillars of our strategy, but it's through that health lens. You know, how do we implement and support countries to implement programs that will reach marginalized and vulnerable populations because we can't achieve the objectives. And the board has several strategies depending on the populations that we implement. And we now have guidance. We have a human rights reference group as well that relates to the Human Rights Commission's human rights reference group and UNAIDS's human rights reference group. And we're working intensively on how to do that. I actually would like you to give your examples because you do it in person. I just get the briefing notes. You actually do it and could describe it more. But we're really intentionally, from the beginning of the cycle of the country dialogue through to the grant making, very intently focused on this issue. And our teams, as you know, are very focused on, but it really going to come into the country dialogue process, which I think would be great for you to give your examples of that process. Myanmar, by the way, was a great example of how that happened, but please go ahead because I know you have great.
Before you do, Don, how long are you going to, is it going to be about 2 or 3 minutes? Okay, the web stream people want to see you.
I'll do that. So the strategic plan, which has human rights as a key pillar, was adopted in November 2011. Then the Global Fund went through completely changing its business model and inventing, I have to say, through his head chiefly, what's called the country dialogue process, replacing the way the Global Fund received applications. And among the things, among the requirements in the country dialogue is that the key affected populations in each country is part of the team that develops the application. And so you have, in many countries, MSM and transgender, sex workers, and in quite a few countries, some injectors. In Africa, not very many, because the governments choose to believe there's not much injecting. So they're sitting right in the development process of the application and able to raise the human rights issues, among other things, in terms of barriers to health. Is this working perfectly at the moment? This is the first trial, the first iteration. In some countries it actually has worked very well, but in others it has not. But the other things countries have are required to do is to consider the human rights framework, and there are specific pots of funding available to ensure that there is some funding done or to work towards the human rights objectives of the Global Fund. And so I think why this is so groundbreaking is this is the first time where anything like this has happened. Previously in Global Fund applications, the key populations really had not much access at all. The amounts of money for human rights are not big, but in some ways they don't need to be big compared to ARV budgets or other prevention program budgets. So I think that's a big change that we, civil society organisations and particularly the key populations, need to keep in mind and encourage and support our members in country and to be involved in that process as much as possible and to be assertive in it.
All right, does anybody have any final questions? No? In light of, oh, yeah, all right, yes, one over there. Hang on, wait for the microphone.
My name's Julie Bates. I've been a sex worker rights advocate for 30 years. Can you hear me? Yeah. And I've been part of that movement that has fought hard and long for law reform in New South Wales. And I sit here today still and see how it's still not working for people like me. You go along to a bank as a sex worker and try to get a loan. Forget it. Most banks won't lend you money. Try and rent a home, a whole range of things that just don't work for you today, even though we have decriminalisation and we're no longer an illegal entity. So when are we going to see anti-discrimination protection in New South Wales, Tim?
Well, one of the great challenges you have in this office is that while you're Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, you're predominantly focusing on federal law and not state law. But I can say equally that I recently met with Fiona Patton, who I'm sure is familiar to you, but perhaps not to others, to talk explicitly about some of these issues that directly affect sex workers and the fact that they face discrimination. And I don't know what she is, sorry for clarity, Fiona Patton is the head of the Sex Party in Australia, and she's also a member of the Victorian Legislative Council. I'm not at liberty to say what she may or may not be doing in this space, but it is a recurring theme that has been raised with us by the Scarlet Alliance as part of my rights and responsibilities consultations last year, and these issues will be raised as part of our report, which will be released at the end of this month. At the end of March next month. So they are things that I am very mindful of, but I can't give you an exact date about whether you're going to get that particular piece of legislation or whether that's even the best way of going about it, because some of these issues need proper engagement, as has been said, to try and address the challenges being faced by sex workers. So thank you very much for the final question to me, which really, now we're actually a trio. With the three of us on stage. But ladies and gentlemen and friends, can you please thank Don Baxter and Mark Dybel for their wonderful presentations this evening. Particular thanks to you, Mark, as you did most of the performance, but Don, you came in at the end and saved us, so we appreciate that. Can I also just finally again thank Nick Parkhill from ACON, Bill Botel from Pacific Friends, and of course the wonderful staff, including Siri May and others at the Australian Human Rights Commission who put this event on this evening. Thank you very much for coming. There are sandwiches at the back for those of you who are here in physical presence. Sorry, there might be sandwiches in the kitchen for those people on the web. And thank you very much for coming this evening.